Hello everyone and welcome to the ValueNotes webinar. Our topic today is navigating India's complex markets using actionable intelligence. Today's presenters are Arun Jethmalani, he is Managing Director at ValueNotes, and me, Varsha Chitale. I'm a director and I look after the CI practice. So this is how we will proceed today. First, Arun will give you a short introduction to ValueNotes, and then I'll take you through the complexities and the characteristics of Indian markets and also various effective ways of gathering competitive intelligence. Finally, Arun will come back and walk you through a couple of case studies that are based on our own research that we've done in the past. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat window and we'll address them all together at the end of the main presentation. So now it's over to Arun.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning as the case may be. I think we're still waiting for a few people to join in. So I'll run through a quick introduction of ValueNotes before Varsha gets into the main subject of today's webinar. So ValueNotes is a business research and competitive and market intelligence firm. We're located in India in a city called Pune and have been in business for about 13 years. Right? We have around 70 employees, most of whom have postgraduate or professional qualifications. Our analysts come from diverse backgrounds, commerce, engineering, economics, statistics, life sciences, and that allows us to have multifunctional teams depending on the nature of the project. A lot of our analysts have worked in industry. In terms of customers, we serve customers from all over the world, US, Europe, Middle East, China, Asia Pacific, Australia, and of course in India. We take pride in our values, in the independence of our research, the fact that it's unbiased, and that we follow high ethical standards in the collection of information and the presentation of information. And ultimately, the objective is to provide value to our customers by meeting very specific research needs. And in the last 5 years, we've completed more than 100 competitive intelligence or market intelligence projects just in the India geography. We've done work in other geographies as well, but in India there's been more than 100 projects. These have typically been for companies, large companies, multinationals, and consultants who are advising similar companies on their India strategy or growth, diversification, etc. As I mentioned, these are highly customized to suit specific customer needs. They could be around market sizing and segmentation, opportunity assessment, product launch intelligence, competitor benchmarking, news monitoring, etc. And this has been across several sectors, including IT, BPO, financial services, engineering, healthcare, etc. Our research has been quoted in the international media and publications like The Economist, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, etc. We've also been recognized by a number of organizations, have presented at a number of conferences, including SKIP conferences in the US, Brazil, Rome, etc. And amongst Indian competitive intelligence companies, we regard ourselves as one of the pioneers. We're not really aware of many companies that have this length and breadth of experience, right? We've also been very active in trying to build a CI community in India. We have a LinkedIn group called Competitive Intelligence Network India. We're also working with SKIP to start an India chapter. So that's really all about ValueNotes, and I think all of you are waiting to get into the meat of today's presentation. So I'll hand over now to Varsha, who will take you through the rest. If any of you have any questions about ValueNotes, please send a mail or write a question on the webinar screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. So we'll tackle today's theme in 3 parts. First, we'll look at the characteristics of Indian markets and what they mean for competitive intelligence. We'll then look at ways to overcome the challenges and go into what it takes to get actionable intelligence in India. And finally, as I mentioned, we'll go to the case studies. So here are some key characteristics of Indian markets that impact competitive intelligence. One is that the markets are largely unorganized. They are highly fragmented. A large grey market exists in many sectors. And finally, the level of documentation is very low. So let's look at what each of these mean. So what do we mean by unorganized? It means that enterprises are not registered with any authority, or they are not regulated, or they don't maintain books of accounts. These are typically small private enterprises owned by individuals or households, and they are operated as proprietary firms or on a partnership basis. In India, as many as 80% of the enterprises are unregistered. The unorganized sector employs more than 90% of the workforce and contributes close to 60% of GDP. A big chunk of the unorganized activity is related to agriculture. But even in the non-agricultural sectors, it's quite significant. It comprises about 40% in mining, manufacturing and infrastructure and about 47% in services. Secondly, as I mentioned, most industry sectors are fragmented. What that means is they comprise of a very large number of small enterprises. And this is true actually even in the organized sector. Historically, certain sectors were reserved as what were called the small-scale industries. So in these reserved industries, enterprises couldn't grow beyond a certain size, and this led to fragmentation. Now, over the years, the number of industries that were reserved as small scale have reduced considerably, but the high level of fragmentation still persists. The small scale sector, which is now called micro, small and medium enterprise sector, which is MSME, it contributes about 8% of GDP, 50% of manufactured exports, 45% of industrial employment. And as many as 95% of all industrial units are in the MSME sector. 90% of these are proprietary firms. There are only a few industries like banking, telecom, insurance, for instance, which have a finite and known number of players, limited number of players. In other sectors, there could be a few, 3, 4 relatively large, well-known players, and then a very large number of small, possibly regional companies. The hospital industry, for example, fits into this category, or real estate is another example. So a very large number of hospitals have less than 5 beds. And similarly, among builders, there are hundreds of small builders with just 1 or 2 projects in their portfolio. The grey market in India is also quite large. Now this is defined as a market where the goods and services are bought and sold without paying taxes. So sales tax, import duties and so on. Domestically, grey markets exist for a large number of products such as auto components, alcohol, computer hardware, personal goods, packaged goods, mobile phones, tobacco and so on. Imported goods such as electronics, pharmaceuticals, computer peripherals, spares, all these also fall in the grey market. Now, estimating the size of grey markets is challenging because obviously there are no records here. For instance, I came across an article which estimated that 60 to 90% of iPods in India are sold through the grey market. Now you'll notice that the estimate is actually very wide, 60 to 90%. And this is because there's no real hard data here. Such broad estimates are not really usable for any practical purposes. Now it's impossible to get accuracy here, but with appropriate methodologies, it's possible to narrow down these estimated ranges so that they can actually be used for planning and strategizing. Another key feature in India which complicates the research and CI activity is the sheer diversity in the country. So there are 30 states with wide differences in terms of income levels, economic development, education, literacy, culture, languages, even government regulations. So for example, literacy rates are over 90% in a state like Kerala. As against say only about 50% in Bihar. Per capita incomes vary. In Haryana, they could be as high as 70,000 rupees, and in Manipur, they could be as low as 21,000 rupees. Culture, food habits, preferences again are not uniform at all. For example, we were advising a client on the almond market in India. So in the northern states, almonds are used in food preparation, and so the consumption is very high, quite high. On the other hand, in the south, consumption is almost negligible, and this is because they use cashew in their food instead of almonds. In terms of regulation as well, under the country's federal structure, the administration is decentralized. So some areas such as defense, railway, atomic energy, banking, shipping, and others come under the central government jurisdiction. But there are many others like water, power, education, liquor, police, and so on, which are decided at the state level. So every state now has its own policies and regulations. Finally, even the amount of documentation that's available varies across states. So some states have very good data and statistics, whereas in others, it's very hard to get anything at all. So to conclude, for all practical purposes, when you're doing CI in India, you're actually doing it in multiple markets, multiple diverse markets. Bringing all these characteristics and factors together, one can see that the statistical machinery in the country is really burdened. What with a large number of enterprises, diverse states, regulations, statistics, data, and so on. Additionally, the private sector statistical machinery is quite weak, unlike in other developed countries. There are about 150 industry associations in India, but only a very few of them are strong and have their own databases. Most others are weak both in terms of membership as well as their scope of activities. There are some organizations like the CMI, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, which is in the private sector, and research institutes like, say, the NCAER, the National Council for Applied Economic Research. Now, these do collect their own data and statistics, but they are nowhere close to being comprehensive. There are very few private sector databases because mainly this market, the market for information in India, is immature. There are simply not enough people wanting to pay for the data. But this is changing rapidly, and we expect that as the demand for data increases, the number of data providers will also grow. The government is currently the key agency that collects data. Now, the nodal agency is the National Statistical Office with its two wings, the NSSO, the National Sample Survey Organization, and the CSO, the Central Statistical Organization. The NSO undertakes some large surveys on its own as well, including the national census. Then there are various ministries and departments of the government that collect their own statistics as part of their administrative function, and the NSO helps coordinate this. At the state level, the organization is similar to that at the central level. And so again, you have individual state level ministries responsible for their own statistics. Now, given that there's a huge amount of activity that's under the states, so you have over 66 subjects, including some of which I mentioned, health, police, agriculture, libraries, museums, education, and so on, which are under the state. If the depth of information in the states varies, there's really not much the NSO can do. So if the ground level data is not there, the NSO can't have good data. But even for the data that the government does have, which it does publish, we found it has many flaws. Firstly, there are some major data gaps. So there are some sectors, as I mentioned, the real estate sector. So data on stock of housing, number of housing starts, number of houses under construction, and so on, it's simply not collected. Given that housing is an important sector in India, housing and construction, this is really a serious problem. We've come across many such data black holes from time to time. The government data is also not always easy to find. So not all of it is put up on websites or published. So one really needs to go and ask each agency and find out, find out what is available. Every now and then we've also come across discrepancies in the data given by different agencies. Sometimes there are even errors in the data. For example, one company we were consulting with found that the internal figures of how much of a particular product they imported varied very widely from what the government claimed they imported. So the Directorate General of Commercial Intelligence and Stats, the DGCIS, they had reported numbers which were actually as much as 40% off the mark. On another occasion, we found that there was a error in the decimal point. So it was in the wrong place. So the figures were all off by a magnitude of 10. What all this means is that, yes, the government data is a good source of information and mostly reliable, but it can be used only as a starting point. It's a good idea to do some other cross-validations, reality checks on it in order to verify that it really can be used. So how does one do CI in this environment? One cannot rely on secondary data as there's simply not enough of it, and whatever there is needs to be tested for quality. So you need to go out into the market and collect a lot of primary intelligence, and you need to validate and triangulate your findings. You sometimes have to use innovative methodologies to ensure that the data you have is reliable, and then you can analyze it and get actionable intelligence from it. Jugaad is an Indian word that stands for improvised solutions. Inventiveness, ingenuity, cleverness, adapting resources to meet immediate short-term needs. And Jugaad is often what is required for getting actionable intelligence in India. Starting with secondary data, we find that macroeconomic data and data on registered companies is quite well covered. But the quality of micro data is generally lower. As far as industry data is concerned, some industries like telecom, insurance, banking have fairly good macro data. But micro data again is of questionable quality. As I mentioned earlier, in some industries like real estate, even macro data is not available. Getting to government data first involves figuring out which agency is likely to have the data. So, will the central ministry have it? Will the state ministry have it? Will it be the CSO, NSSO, or will the municipal corporations have it? Or will it be some other office? So what you need to figure out is who has jurisdiction over the activity that you're researching. You need to figure out all the places where the economic activity interacts with a government agency. So do they need to register with any authority? Are they paying any taxes? Do they need any clearances? For example, for clearance from the Pollution Control Board. There are authorities that they interact with, and these authorities are likely to have records of the interactions. For example, if a certain kind of tax is being paid, the authority collecting the tax will have data on all the enterprises paying the tax and also the quantum of tax being paid. And this can give us an estimate of the size of the economic activity. We can then approach the authority to see if they have the data. Some of it may be published, some may not. Some of the data may be in digital format, others may be lying in their office in hard files, and we need to accordingly go and get it. So the key source of information in unorganized and fragmented markets is primary research. There are different types of respondents for primary research who will be able to give various kinds of information and insights. And these include competitors, distributors, dealers, industry experts, HR consultants, system integrators, suppliers, contractors, employees, bankers, and so on. Just about anybody who has anything to do with the area that we are researching. An important step while doing CI is to first figure out who has the information and how can they be motivated to share it with us. Every transaction leaves a trail is a well-known adage used in competitive intelligence. What this means is that nothing a company or an organization does can be done entirely in isolation. So for every activity, there are bound to be some external touch points. And these are the places that can be tapped for getting information. So here is an example to demonstrate what I mean. A pharma company was supposedly undertaking some expansion in its plant in rural Uttar Pradesh, which is a state in North India. We needed to understand the rationale for this expansion and exactly what the company was doing really. So this was naturally confidential information as far as the company was concerned, but we realized that there would be several entities involved if such an expansion was indeed happening. And they would all have little bits of information on what was going on. Construction contractors, suppliers of raw material to the plant, logistics service providers for moving equipment and construction material, HR consultants for hiring workers and managers for the plant, distributors, and so on. We spoke to all of them. Some gave us more information than others. We also found that the neighborhood grapevine in the village was very strong. So the security personnel, the village headmen, workers working in neighboring factories, they all had bits of information that could be used to validate and cross-check our hunches. So although the expansion plans were confidential, it was possible for us to get a decent understanding of what was going on. In practice, it's not as easy to do this kind of primary research. In India, networks are very important. If you approach a stranger for some information, your query may or may not be entertained. But if you say you're a friend's friend, people will definitely hear you out and try to help you to the extent they can. We have found social networking sites very useful here. So sites like Facebook, LinkedIn, Orchid are very handy for identifying such connections. So friends, contacts, and so on. If the information we are seeking is not sensitive, the respondents actually are quite pleased that someone values the knowledge they have, and they are very happy to share it with us. In other cases, you can offer to share a short summary of your findings with the respondents to motivate them, and we've seen that this works pretty well. In general, it's not really common to pay the respondents to share their insights. In fact, many respondents may even find this slightly insulting. You can consider a token gift to show your appreciation, particularly if you're doing face-to-face interviews. There are exceptions, of course. Doctors, for example, are very familiar with the practice of getting paid for interviews because of the large number of clinical trials that are being done in India. But for most other types of respondents, it's not common to pay for the information. As in other countries, you also need to tweak your approach to suit the type of respondent. You may have to interview an illiterate hawker one day and a CEO the next day. So it's important to use a suitable approach, language, tone, mode of interview, and so on for each. In India in particular, in many situations, we find that respondents warm up to you if you speak to them in their local language. A particular study that comes to mind is one study where we interviewed a very large number of low-income households. And we had to do the entire primary research in local languages. We needed analysts who conversed in over 10 Indian languages. And this is very useful. The challenge in using local language, of course, is to be certain that insights or nuances in the interviews are not lost in translation. So when you're relying on word of mouth to get intelligence, it's really important that you validate and confirm what you find. You can't rely on something one person has told you. Validation can be done by collecting multiple data points from different sources. For example, you may ask 15-20 industry participants to give us their estimate of the size of a particular industry. So you will probably get a variety of estimates from all these people. You will need to disregard the extreme values, the outliers, and then take an average of the remaining data points to get a good estimate of industry size. We also do some common sense checks on our findings, and for this we use proxies. For example, if the turnover of an establishment is dependent on the size of the office, you could measure the office area or seek to find out the office area to see if the turnover estimates make sense. Common sense checks can also be done by looking at the sizes of upstream or downstream economic activities. You can then triangulate your own estimate with the estimates of industry experts, consultants, intermediaries like distributors, and basically participants within the industry. You can also use innovative techniques like extrapolation and so on in order to get some workable estimates in some cases. In the case studies that Arun will be discussing, we'll demonstrate some of these techniques. Last but not least, one needs to be aware that unethical ways of information gathering are prevalent in India. Some amount of under-the-table transactions, bribe giving, and so on is present. This is, of course, not ethical. It is not possible to do competitive intelligence on a regular basis unethically. It is only sustainable if it is done ethically. And we have found that it is possible to do ethical CI in India using some of the methodologies we've described. So I'll now hand over to Arun, who will take you through a couple of case studies to illustrate how primary research combined with innovative methodologies can yield actionable inputs in the unorganized and fragmented market. So over to you, Arun.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to take you through a couple of case studies, slightly different studies that we've done over the years. The first is a study we did for a private equity firm who wanted to understand borrowing patterns in the lower and middle income group. Now this is really people with incomes less than, say, US $200 a month or 10,000 rupees. At that time it was 9,000 rupees a month. And We wanted to understand why they borrow, who they borrow from, what the market dynamics are, growth, and profitability of such businesses. So we had to do market sizing, segmentation across a bunch of different parameters, competitive analysis, understand customer decision making, and understand what drives growth and what the future is going to look like. Now, this is a highly undocumented, fragmented market, right? Unregulated as well. In fact, in recent days, there's been a lot in the media about this kind of unregulated financial institutions. Anyway, the challenges we had, the first thing was how do we segment the target groups? Fine, there is an income category, but the needs of people are very different depending on whether they are small businesses or factory workers, different types of people. And typically people in this income group were, roadside vendors, shopkeepers or employees, taxi drivers, auto rickshaw drivers, vegetable vendors, and people like that. There was no literature, right? There's, barring some information on overall socioeconomic data, income groups across different states and things like that, there was no data on the actual borrowing or financial, transactions done by this group of people. It was very difficult to actually do interviews for a number of reasons. Most of the respondents were not educated, they did not know English, and they did not understand financial jargon, right? So, for example, if you were to ask somebody what is the interest rate on the loan you've taken, they wouldn't know. So we had to design the questionnaires very carefully, taking into account language as well as the way you ask questions. They also felt threatened by interviewers because they're not used to this kind of corporate thing of somebody coming and asking them questions about all this. So this was a big challenge. Because the data was not direct, like we couldn't get data on yield or interest rates or different things, we had to derive these and through a number of different questions. On the supply side, there were a lot of different types of players, highly different both in the nature of how they operate, the kinds of products they had. So this was a big challenge. Now, as you can see, we did some secondary research to get data on overall income groups, demographics, etc. This helped us identify some of the target segments, and then we went and did a massive countrywide primary. Actually, it was not countrywide; it was in a few select cities across the country. As you can see, this entire study depended on primary research. We had to do face-to-face interviews because, again, telephone doesn't work necessarily in this community. Yeah. So we spoke to about 300 borrowers, over 60 lenders, right? And try to understand things like how much they borrow, for why they borrow, different types of things. We then used the supply side data we got from interviews with players and tried to match it to our sample, which was sort of extrapolated based on demand side numbers, and we used this to triangulate some of the information. And we went back to some of the people in the industry and said, hey, these are numbers we've got and what do you think about it? So there was a lot of triangulation, verification done. This just a simple chart of some of the findings. It's interesting to see some of the categories of lenders. So you see money lender is a big thing. This was done before microfinance became big in India. And even in terms of reasons for debt, marriage is a big one. Okay. So that was the first study. The second one was a little different. It was more B2B. In this case, our client was a multinational in food ingredients. They'd been in India for a few years. One of their products, which was a particular specialized food ingredient, was um, a dominant product in its category with, I think, close to 90% market share. There were no competitors in India who had the same technology or could produce the same quality of product. And now a few years later, 3 or 4 years later, these people found that they've suddenly lost close to half their market share. And initially they were complacent and said, hey, all the other guys are coming in with inferior products at much lower prices, so we need not worry about it. But when they lost one of the big chains, one of the big clients, which was a sort of food chain, they suddenly got up and said, hey, this cannot be an inferior quality product. They went and procured that product, tested it in the lab, and found that it was almost as good as what they were making and being sold at about a third of the price. So they got worried and they approached us to try and find out something about who these people were, where the technology was coming from, how is it possible for someone else to make these products, right? Some of the challenges we had is that the companies who were making this product were extremely small companies. It wasn't clear who owned them or who ran them. We had to, of course, get documents from the registrar of companies, but a lot of primary research, including traveling to some of these distant locations in India to find out the factories. There was no literature, of course, on the product or the industry, and we had to interview industry experts, food technology, educational establishments, and a lot of distributors and customers. Again, import data was just not available, but we did get some data, and then we actually spoke to suppliers of certain raw materials in China and Malaysia, etc., to get more information. Again, this is a very fragmented, the food industry. There are literally hundreds and thousands of establishments that consume this product, right? In a typical, comparative intelligence fashion, what we were able to do is, build together hundreds of isolated data points into a picture, into an overall picture, just like you do a jigsaw. So again, primary was really the key to the study. And on this slide, you can see some of the kinds of things that we did. What we found is that there are several competitors, especially there were 3 significant competitors. We identified who these people were, where they got the technology from, where they got the raw materials from, how they were distributing their product, what customers felt about them in terms of their response time, deliveries, etc., as well as their future expansion plans. So we found that the technology was available. It was being imported from China in some cases with some indigenous development. And this whole study actually changed the strategy for our client. Till that point, they were importing the product from Europe. And after this, they realized that, hey, we have to set up domestic manufacturing. Otherwise, we won't be competitive. We also, in the process, help them identify some low-cost producers of certain key raw materials. So it changed a lot in terms of their strategy going forward. And, this was really in an industry, in a sector where there was absolutely no information, very fragmented, undocumented. So we think, we look back on this and look at this as one very difficult assignment that went off very well. I think that's it for now. If you have questions, we'll be happy to take them. Just have to type them into the little box on your screen.
Thank you, Arun. We seem to have a few questions. The first is from Hari Kumar. He asks, what is triangulation and how can this be used for researching market dynamics? I'll let Arun tackle that one.
There's a lot of literature on triangulation, but essentially it is trying to arrive at the same answer or number through different approaches. So typically, if you have to do say, assess the size of a particular market, you could do it using a top-down method, a bottom-up method, or you could aggregate across certain parameters from the supply side, or do calculations based on demand estimates. The idea is to try and get multiple answers to your question using different methods, and then you compare them, and if they are in the same ballpark, you don't have to worry. If they're not, then you need to look at your research again. So this is a fairly standard process in any type of research, and there is a lot of literature online. If you want to know more, send us a mail and we'd be happy to share with you some documentation.
Okay, we have a question from Sham, and he wants to know, did you use mystery shopping technique to understand how the value chain works? Or is mystery shopping still deemed a gray area in terms of ethics in India? So Sham, yes, we do use mystery shopping as one of the techniques, but you're right, it is a gray area, and so in some cases it is really unethical, and let me explain what I mean. So say you're doing mystery shopping for a retail product where you have to go into various shops and pretend you're buying something. So you ask for the price, you ask the salesperson about the product, you see how the person is actually selling it to you, and so on. This we feel is perfectly fine. It's ethical to do that, because in order to buy a retail product, you anyway have to do that. You don't have to reveal your own identity when you buy a retail product. And so mystery shopping in such circumstances is perfectly legitimate. In certain cases, B2B cases, where say sales happen through tenders, or where you need to float an RFP in order to get the price from the company, you could go into unethical areas. For instance, if I want to figure out the price of a product which is not publicly available and I have to send a RFP, I will need to lie about who I am, if I want that company to respond. And misrepresentation, as I explained earlier, or as you may have seen on our slide, we didn't go into it in detail, is not ethical. So I cannot say I'm a fictitious company wanting to buy a particular service or a product and ask for its price. So yes and no for mystery shopping. Yes, in certain cases it's fine, but in cases where you need to misrepresent yourself or pretend to be somebody else in order to do mystery shopping, then it's not ethical. I hope that answers your question. We'll go on to the next one. Which one is it?
So there's a question about from Neeraj Deshpande, who says, apart from primary research and secondary research, is there any other tool used for gathering competitor information? Very broadly, these are the two sort of broad approaches. One is you talk to people, and the other is you look at what is already published. So there are broad categories of information. Within primary, there are many, many different things you could do. Interviews, face-to-face, online, focus groups. There's a number of different techniques that work for different situations. Again, in secondary, apart from what is available online. There will be specialized publications. There will be databases that you can purchase. And stuff. But broadly, everything is either coming from an individual you talk to or it's been published.
Yeah. What is your, Catherine Frank wants to know, what is your experience in talking to doctors? Are the answers reliable? Do you need triangulation? Does it work on the phone? And what about incentives? Talking to doctors, firstly, yes, you can do it on the phone. Yes, you do need to give incentives. You can do it on the phone, but face-to-face works better, is what we have found. Yes, you can give incentives. In fact, many of them will expect to get incentives, or they'll get expected to get paid for the time that they spend with you. Are the answers reliable? We have found that they are pretty reliable, but as in all other cases, we would strongly recommend triangulation. I don't think you can ever rely on what a particular doctor or what a particular professional is telling you, unless it's a question you're asking about their profession where they, which puts their integrity at on the line. Like say a chartered accountant, if you ask him for his opinion, he is bound to give you as correct an answer as he can. But I would strongly recommend triangulation in all cases. We have another question from Preeti here. She asks, what are proxy indicators?
Okay, so proxy indicators are really indicators that are related to something you're trying to find. For example, let's say you are looking for revenue numbers and revenue numbers are not available. You could do things like headcount into revenue per employee. These numbers might be easier to get and you'll arrive at an estimate. Of course, it won't be necessarily 100% accurate, but in most cases, especially when you're looking at revenue data or market size numbers, you need to think of something else, a related item that can be where data is available. Another example could be, let's say, you're looking at a particular machinery and that machinery has a number of components. You might be able to get data on some of the components, right? Which will give you an idea of how much of that machinery sells. So there could be various types of proxies. You have to look at each product that you are studying or market and try to find out other parameters that might help you. In fact, this is recommended in almost every case because this is what allows you to triangulate. Yeah, there are a few more questions coming in. There is a question from Sanjay Bajaj. How can CI be useful and applicable in the services sector, specifically in technical event management?
CI, competitive intelligence, is it's really basically understanding what is happening in your business environment in order to gain a competitive advantage over the other players in the sector. So the objective of CI is to really improve your business performance. So in any sector, and even in the services sector, I think if you want to improve your own competitive strategy, so you might want to understand, okay, what do my customers want? People who attend the events, what are they looking for? How can I improve the attendance at my event? What are the other event? Who are my competitors? And your competitors may not just be event management companies. They could be other people who offer the same service, offer a venue for people to come together and discuss what's happening in their industry, and they would also be your competitors. So essentially you would want to understand who are your competitors, what are they doing, who are your customers, what do they want, and how can you improve the value you provide to your customers. So competitive intelligence is really equally applicable to all the sectors. I hope that answers your question. Is gifting ethical? This is a question from Namrata. Is gifting ethical? We have, gifting per se is not ethical if it constitutes a bribe. If the person is giving you the information because you're giving the gift, it is not really ethical, because you're giving that in lieu of money, or instead of giving money for the answer, you're actually giving a gift. But typically we find that, giving a token of appreciation, which is not, the value of which is not really important. It's just something to say thank you for helping us out. That is fine, and I think that is ethical. So there's no problem with that. We're just looking for which is the next question.
There's a question from Sham. What are the techniques you use to introduce yourself to a person in a primary interview without compromising the identity of a client or their objective? I would suppose non-disclosure agreements are yet to seep through in India. So this is, a rather difficult one to answer quickly, but you have to think through each specific situation. You cannot lie and say that I am a student and I am doing this. At least we don't do that. We always state that we are from ValueNotes and we are doing research. We don't disclose for whom we are doing the research, and we're not allowed to, except in very specific cases. It does happen that people then refuse to talk to us, but that's the sort of luck of the draw. That's how the business works. In terms of, techniques to introduce yourself and what kind of, conversations do you have? How do you induce people to talk? It's a fairly comprehensive subject, and in fact we do some training around this in terms of how do you go and get interviews, how do you introduce yourself, how do you think. But there's no simple answer. It's often really depends on the ingenuity of the primary researcher, his ability to sort of get people to like him or her, and therefore agree to participate. Okay, I think there are no more questions, and if we've missed any, we can always do it over mail, right? We're also running out of time. So thanks a lot, all of you, for participating. And if you have any questions, send them on mail. You can write in questions to Varsha's email ID or to the ID on your screen, research@valuenotes.co.in. We will post a recording of today's webinar on our website and send you a link. So those of you who want to download it or have missed part of it, you can, get a copy and share with others who may have interested. We also will mail out a feedback form, and we'd be really happy if you could fill that out and let us know what you thought of the presentation, right? So thanks again for sparing the time to attend today's webinar, and I hope it was useful, and if each of you at least got one or two small insights out of this, I think it would be worth the effort. Thanks.
Thank you, and good afternoon to you all.